No? Yes, I do. Yeah. No, there's no video. Yeah. No. Oh, hi everyone. Just sorry, just getting set up. Thank you for that introduction, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for being here. I've only just arrived, but this is already one of the most remarkable programs I've ever experienced. I've heard a lot about it over the years, and it's just really wonderful to be with you. I think that if we had programs like this all around the world, we would have an end to nuclear weapons, and certainly a vision to get us there, because this is what it takes. Actually, that's kind of a request. Can you replicate this elsewhere? Can you take what you've learned here and help bring what your experience to other people? Because I think, that's something I'm going to talk about, is how we get there. How do we get to the end of nuclear weapons? Because I think we've seen a lot, we've heard a lot, and looking at these panels, you all had a lot of information about what the problem is, and I'll go through some of that too. But I think the solutions are something that I hope that we can help direct everyone towards and inspire everyone to take forward. My story also began in high school, I should say. I grew up in a time, as we've just heard about, during the Cold War, where nuclear weapons were a very prominent story in a lot of people's lives. And I thought a lot about it, but the lessons that I had learned at that time were really fixated on how nuclear weapons were keeping us safe, or how nuclear deterrence works, and how nuclear weapons ended World War II. And I was steeped in a lot of that perspective as well. And it was during high school that I read John Hersey's Hiroshima. Has anyone heard of it? It was, for me, a turning point. There are lots of ways to get there, but it is a first-hand account of what was happening in Hiroshima, what was really happening at the time, and it changed the way I thought about nuclear weapons. I studied it that was my focus as an undergraduate student, and I wrote my honors thesis about it. I didn't really do much about it, though, in the following college. I pursued the arts. I had a background before that, my whole family in music and in performance, and this was not something that was very much in my mind for a bit. It was when I was, many years later, I was a lawyer, I was teaching law, and I was teaching law in Japan, and visited Hiroshima, that again, I just realized that this was really what I wanted to be working on. So that's kind of my story. That got me to the negotiations for the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and it's been a wild ride ever since, and I'll tell you a bit more about it. I wonder if these slides are working. Are they? No, right, I see they're not here, right? Okay. Any thoughts on getting them? I can talk without them, but I thought some visual aids would be helpful. Well, I did prepare some slides, just so you know. So I'm not just pretending. But a lot about risks and consequences, and then a lot about solutions. But I know you heard yesterday from Dr. Helfand, and so I'm sure you are well steeped in what happens in the event of a nuclear attack, and what happens to our human bodies, what happens in the immediate aftermath of a nuclear attack, but also what happens in the weeks and the months and the years that follow to people and to the environment, to the natural environment. I could spend a little bit more time talking about it. It is Halloween after all, so maybe we can be a little more scared and talk about what happens. Well, the first thing I was going to talk about, I guess in that context, was risk. And how close you think we are right now to nuclear war, how dangerous you think it is. Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
I need a request to share the slides.
You need a request.
Maybe you need to approve it.
Ah.
Yeah, Anne-Sophie is the one requesting.
Ah.
Please share.
This is going great. Don't worry. We got just request access. I need access. Hold on. I promise I can. Just multitasking for a second. All right, I've granted access, I think. So, I mean, we just heard a bit about, oh, done. Okay, I think I granted access now. We heard a bit about what the situation was like during the Cold War, and how dangerous it was, but also how we had some progress during the Cold War as well. And you know, I think that when the Berlin Wall fell, and as we just heard from the last speaker, Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev were talking about getting us to nuclear weapons reductions. A lot of people, including myself, thought we were on the path to something a lot safer. And so that's why it would surprise, I think, a lot of people to realize that it is more dangerous now, according to most experts today, than it ever was during the Cold War, and thus probably ever was in history. We are closer to the possibility of a nuclear weapons use than we ever have been since their invention. And we have some people who have done, you know, some of these experts have estimated that a child born today has approximately a 50% chance of experiencing nuclear war. You know, that's basically, if you do statistics, like an annualized probability of 0.09%, but over the course of a 75-year life would basically be over a 50% chance, actually, but chance of experiencing nuclear war. And you know, that as it was in the 1980s, I think we are seeing cultures pick this up now. So we are seeing more people like you come to be interested in this subject. We are seeing more movies being made. Has anyone seen House of Dynamite yet? That's the newest one that just came out, yeah? So, you know, I think we can talk about that and why the risks are so high. It's not because we have more nuclear weapons. You know, I think we just heard about how we did get to the reductions. So how is it that if we had, you know, at the peak, over 64,000 nuclear weapons, but today there are, I think you've heard the number by now, but over 12,000, right? 12,241 we estimate. Why, if it's decreasing, are we actually in a more dangerous position now? And we point to a number of reasons. There's an increase in the number of nuclear weapons that are deployed for use, more than ever are deployed. An increase in their destructive capability. The bombs that are in arsenals today are orders of magnitude more destructive than what the US dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. An erosion of norms and laws. Many of the treaties are disappearing. And we have more and more threats to use nuclear weapons. You've all probably seen in the news, even just in the last hours, how Donald Trump announced that he was going to resume nuclear testing. All of these things are increasing risk. There's an increase in the use of cyber technology and artificial intelligence in communication, command and control systems. That's something that House of Dynamite sort of touches on somewhat. And there's also been an increase in the number of actors that have access to nuclear weapons compared to the height of the Cold War, where we had a maximum 5 countries that had nuclear weapons. Now we have 9, right? I think did we cover that much yesterday? We know that there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. You know, one thing that when people talk about those 9 countries, they leave out is that there are 6 more countries where nuclear weapons are what they say, hosted. You know, it sounds so benign, but nuclear weapons are kept by 6 other countries, and they are technically the weapons of the US and of Russia. So we're talking about Netherlands and Belgium and Germany, Turkey, Italy, and now Belarus, where nuclear weapons exist also. And all of these things are increasing the risk. You know, I think, and some of the, you know, once upon a time, of course, many of you would know, nuclear weapons used to be hosted in Canada. It wasn't until 1984, I think, that nuclear weapons were here, right? Even today, we have nuclear weapons not so far from Winnipeg in North Dakota, 4.5-hour drive, that nuclear weapons exist even today. Again, all things that are raising risk. You know, and a lot of this is driven by the military-industrial complex. There's no question about that. I just heard, I think someone, well, maybe it was Sarah in introductions, but talk about spending. We're spending over $100 billion a year on nuclear arsenals. That's an increase of $10 billion from the year before. So not only are we spending this vast amount of money that you probably can't, I mean, what does $10 billion, sorry, $100 billion even mean to us? It's hard to even sort of conceptualize some of these numbers. But to know that it's increasing so fast, there's only one result when people invest so much, and I think it was just discussed. When you're building more weapons, you're building them to be used, to be tested, and eventually used. And so this is all what makes it very, very scary. And I think at the right time, if you haven't activated yet, to make a change. Now, I think a bit about consequences. Again, we learned a bit about this yesterday, I suppose, from Ira's presentation and some of these panels, and perhaps you've looked into this a bit. You've learned about what nuclear weapons really do. I was going to put up a little demonstration from this website you could check out if you haven't found it yet, called NukeMap. Well, here it is almost. Great, great, look, magic. Oh, it's gone again, okay. Well, you know, sometimes when tech fails, I always think to myself, well, this is another reason why when the talking heads on military analysts and others are telling us, that nuclear weapons are under control and we have, our tech is really sophisticated. We know our tech fails. And the more that we give over to tech, the more that we give over to AI, the more dangerous this whole situation becomes. So this was all a demonstration. No, but I think that if I don't get the slide up, you could go to this site I was going to show you, nukemap.org, and you could drop essentially a virtual weapon over your city. Perhaps drop one over Winnipeg and actually watch what it does and how many people die. And it will show you, how many people are killed instantaneously. It will show you, how many people would be injured, and how, about half of the injured we know would probably die from third-degree burns within the next several days. But you can see, what happens from the initial flash of energy that burns hotter than the core of the sun, what happens from the blast that can pulverize. I guess that's not for me, that must be for my slides. I'll just skip ahead to that slide. Costs, there you go. And here. Yeah, so this was just me dropping a hypothetical W80 warhead over Winnipeg, if I picked that weapon because I think that was the one that that exists in North Dakota, so it's pretty close by, and we've seen throughout history the number of accidents and miscalculations that have led to accidental drops of weapons that should have, but somehow didn't totally destroy humanity. Well, this is one of the weapons that's close by. And it's considered small to medium in the context of weapons that are in arsenals today and that we've invented. But that's a bit deceptive too, because when we talk about these smaller weapons or tactical nuclear weapons, we should realize that they're all bigger, almost all of them are bigger than what was dropped over Hiroshima. And so it's always a very disingenuous description. The W80, for example, is 10 times the size of the Hiroshima bomb. So we can see from this little modeling that a good percentage of the Winnipeg population would be killed instantaneously, and then of those estimated injuries, the 221,000, about 50% of whom would die in the next hours or days. And then it breaks it out in terms of everyone in that innermost circle where the red dot is. They're vaporized instantaneously from that flash of energy. and those in the next perimeter would experience the pressure wave that would basically crush anything, people, cars, buildings, trees to dust. And then a wider, the yellow circle there, that's the radius of the thermal flash that would set anything that could burn on fire, give anyone exposed to it third-degree burns. And you know, like I said, about half of the people who experience third-degree burns, especially because, you know, anywhere within this map you have no functioning healthcare system, would also die. So this is a bit about what happens immediately. There's other models that help us understand increasingly what happens in the longer term and the climate-related effects of nuclear weapons. You know, nuclear weapons represent the most acute threat that exists to the climate, acute in that it can happen on a very rapid timescale that we would see so much, if a nuclear weapon was detonated over a city or an industrialized area, so much soot and debris would be lofted into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun. And in the worst case event, if it was a US and Russia model, we would see an ice age event. That's the concept of nuclear winter that you've perhaps heard of in the past. And that also helps us see the connection, I think, of those of us who are seized of the climate crisis need to be thinking about nuclear weapons as well, and the reason that a lot of these problems intersect. Any use of nuclear weapons would have catastrophic humanitarian consequences for which we would have no adequate response. But so does, when I say any use, I think a lot of us think about use in the context of conflict, and it makes us forget sometimes that nuclear weapons are hurting people right now, today. And this includes in the context of nuclear so-called testing. So this brings us to the comments we've heard in the last couple of days from the United States about restarting testing. You know, we have used nuclear weapons in the sense more than 2,000 times. That very first detonation that, if you've seen the movie Oppenheimer, you were learning a bit about, or perhaps, hopefully, you've also learned a little bit about Trinity in other spaces too, but that very first detonation of nuclear weapons in the desert of New Mexico, we now know spread radioactive fallout to 46 US continental states, but also Mexico and also Canada. So we know increasingly that these so-called tests have had massive impacts on local communities and usually indigenous communities because, you know, the US doesn't test around Washington, D.C., France doesn't test around Paris. They test in places where they've historically had spheres of colonial influence. So, you know, the US tested in the Marshall Islands and the South Pacific. And they tested along indigenous communities' lands in the US. The Russians tested in Semipalatinsk in Kazakhstan, testing in Western Australia. People are still in these places living with the echoes of the fallout and the forced displacement. Children are still born sometimes without bones today. So when we talk about nuclear weapons and people talk about whether or not they are preventing a war, we should always remember to think about the people who are affected immediately, you know, in the meantime, while people prepare for war. It's not a theoretical discussion. And the people that are harmed most today are the people here, are younger people. And so I just wanted to focus a little bit about young people as both in terms of both consequences to you and also as far as you having the opportunities to lead solutions. You know, I think young people today, you're presented with one of the rawest deals imaginable. You're delivered this world with the highest risks, and you face the greatest possibility of long-term consequences, all for a problem that you did not create, you're not responsible for. And what's worse, people are saying, well, it's up to you if it's going to get solved. It's a pretty annoying place, I'd say, to be put. And when I speak about consequences, I think about it in different ways. I mean, one way is biological impacts. ICAN, we published a report last year about the impacts of nuclear weapons on children. And we know that these effects that we were talking about, from the heat, the radiation, in each of these, we see that children have a higher risk of being killed than adults do. More likely to acquire cancers because they're having rapidly expanding cellular growth that's more likely to be picked up by cancer cells. Those that do survive are more likely to carry with them these long-term psychological and physical impacts, have worse health outcomes, especially if their own caretakers are themselves killed. And I think this is something that we've thought a lot about at ICAN over this last year in the context of this 80th anniversary of the first use of nuclear weapons. The people who are alive today who were killed in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were all children, obviously, when the bombs went off. And so we've had very powerful testimony from them about the effects on children. And we only have a limited amount of time to hear from them directly going forward. Their average age is 86 years old. There's other ways to think about it other than the biological harms, the fact that nuclear armed states are more likely to enter into conflict, we know, the fact that, well, the economic effects. If we look at that $100 billion, what else would we be spending that money on? But then there's a role to play in terms of solutions. And this is where I think, we can start shifting this conversation from something that's so bleak to something that's so hopeful. First of all the existential threats in the world that you are looking at, climate crises, refugee crises, socioeconomic divides, this one's the easiest to solve, by far. These weapons were made by humans. They're taken apart by humans. Once the political will is there, the technical process is easy. The hard part is helping everyone understand that. And that's something that we need your help to do, to help show the world that deterrence, nuclear deterrence, is a scam, that nuclear weapons do not keep you safe, that and that people who are traditionally marginalized from this conversation because you're not experts are the ones who really have the most important role to play right now. Young people, in the history of all social movements, young people have had this incredibly important role to play. We're not going to get there without you, and that comes in two forms. One is participation, and the other is discourse. When ICAN won the Nobel Prize in 2017, most of the team was in their 30s. And a lot of this was not just about putting those people in the room, but also centering their voices and making sure that they had something meaningful to change, to disrupt, and had an opportunity to really get in the faces of the status quo, which is what's been holding us back. If we keep turning to the same circles to make about the same problems, we're only going to get the same solutions. And that's why I think the youth movement was so meaningful in terms of getting to where we've gotten with the work that we've done so far. We continue to hear. At every stage of the work that we did, we were told that what we were doing was not going to work. So if you're, if people you're hearing from are saying, well, what they're doing is unrealistic, just keep in mind that that's what we heard at every step. We heard that we weren't going to get to negotiations for a treaty because the P5, we're not going to allow it to happen. We heard that when we got to the negotiations, we weren't going to get the treaty adopted, but we did. And we heard that it wouldn't enter into force, or if it did enter into force, it would take about twice as long as it did. And now we're told that, we're not going to get any of the NATO states to join it, or the nuclear armed states to join it. Why would we trust those voices now? And so the other way in which I think we got to think about your role is just building in these the new ways of thinking about the discourse. Like this is how we got to the treaty in the first place, was centering those voices that were so marginalized. So if you're going to turn to, when you talk about nuclear weapons, you always go back to the security policy experts and the military experts, they're going to give you the same answer if you keep putting them on television to tell you about what nuclear weapons are. What we were able to do, and by the way, when we did this, we stand on the shoulders of what we call the humanitarian disarmament movement that led to, for example, the Ottawa Treaty and landmines, cluster munitions, that did the same thing, and we followed their model, was to center the voices of the true experts on nuclear weapons, the doctors who know what nuclear weapons do to human bodies, climatologists who can talk about what nuclear weapons do to the environment, is the scientists who know how nuclear weapons really work, and most of all, the survivors, who are the truest experts of all about what nuclear weapons do. The populations of non-nuclear weapon states represent more than half of the world. Their voices have also been excluded from the conversation, and part of what we're building is a way to bring them back in. And so we, in 2017, managed to bring about this treaty with the cooperation and partnership of a lot of like-minded governments. How many people, by the way, I'm not going to call on anyone, but had heard of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons before coming to the summit? Oh, okay, a few. And even the work, I think that's sort of a missing panel in this wonderful presentation, even on the placards. We don't have enough people talking about it. So let me just tell you just a bit about the treaty in that case. This is a high-level overview of what it does and what it is. It is the first ever comprehensive prohibition, total prohibition. Everything to do with nuclear weapons is made illegal under this treaty, from the early production stages to testing, to use of course, and threat of use, and also even assisting others with any of the prohibited activities. And it also has a legal framework for eliminating nuclear weapon programs. And not least of all, it is the first treaty to recognize harms to communities that are most affected by nuclear weapons, but also provide for a legal framework for assisting victims and remediating environments that are affected by nuclear weapons use and testing. I have a couple of slides on how we got there and why we got there, and I could talk a little bit about that. I don't know, how am I doing on time? I'm going to skip ahead, actually, so that we can just make sure to get to some more of the things that you can do, I think. But suffice to say that I think we talked a lot about what nuclear weapons do to people and the consequences that they pose. And the way we got there, we initiated these series of humanitarian conferences that got a lot of governments in the room talking about why nuclear weapons were so terrible, and the fact that we had no government had any real response to what happens when they're used. This helped point everyone to the conversation of, well, we do need a prohibition, and that's why we got there. And everyone, the second reason, that we knew that the law did not have a true, we could have a whole discussion, of course, about the legal aspects and the fact that we have the panoply of customary international law and written down treaty law, but that there was a major gap in all of these laws, that there was no comprehensive prohibition of nuclear weapons, and now there is. And that's one way in which now others working on this issue, even if their country isn't ready to join the treaty, can invoke the treaty as a change in law and international law that advances the ball, moves the seesaw of discourse, if you can think about it that way. I think sometimes about the idea of taking something to a far progressive stance that people may or may not be ready for, but the value of pushing for it anyway is that you can move a seesaw to get the ball rolling in any direction that's along the lines of what you want. I think if you can follow this metaphor, even if it's a bit oversimplified, if you put your weight on the middle of a seesaw, it doesn't move, and if you stand on the end of it, that's how you get change, right? And that's part of the thinking here, is that we're simplified. If you put your weight on the middle of a seesaw, it doesn't move, and if you stand on the end of it, that's how you get change, right? And that's part of the thinking here, is that the treaty was also brought about to build pressure for others to do things that moves us towards disarmament, even if it doesn't immediately get us there. So this, by the way, speaking of activism, was something that our group in New York did these illegal projections on the side of the UN when the treaty entered into force in January 2021. So sometimes it takes a little bit of provocative action to get us there. But I have a couple of slides on the TPNW, but now I'm not even sure where I am in time, so I'm going to go quickly through these because I really want to make sure that I get to some things about solutions. This is a slide that just goes through a little bit more detail about what the prohibitions are and how the treaty works in terms of countries having to first tell you what they have or have had in terms of nuclear weapons, and then destroying them and joining the treaty, or joining the treaty and then destroying them, and then how we safeguard, how we make sure that those states don't reacquire nuclear weapons and monitor. And this is the part about, because we have a part about preventing future harm and also addressing this present harm that affected communities experience. Okay, just to give you a little timeline here of our life in the past years since we worked on this treaty. I told you about these humanitarian conferences that happened before the treaty that brought about these negotiations, which happened throughout 2017. On July 7th, 2017, for those of us who were there, this was one of the most exciting days in our lives. The treaty was adopted by a vote of 122 countries in favor and 1 against. And then it became open for signature a few months later. Then we won the Nobel Peace Prize. Then it took a few years for the treaty to enter into force. By the legal terms of the treaty, it required 50 ratifications for that to happen. And then in October 2020, we got that 50th from Honduras. By its terms, would then take 3 months to enter into force. I don't know why I skipped the first MSP here, but first MSP in 2022 in Austria, second MSP in New York, third MSP in New York this year, and now next year we're going to have the first review conference in New York. So some of you, I know some of the organizers here have been to some of these meetings. They really are, even for those who don't like the treaty, they recognize that this is one of the most inclusive, diverse, and dynamic treaty spaces in nuclear weapons that has ever existed. I shouldn't say one of, it is the most. And so I encourage you to engage with it, and we could talk about how you can come to this review conference and participate. Here's how we're doing in terms of the countries that have joined. This little graphic basically represents the 197 countries that can join the treaty at the UN, and shows how we've just a few weeks ago reached the global majority of states that have signed on. So we're in this very exciting moment in terms of building support for the treaty. And that's broken down this way. There's the dark green represents the 74 countries that are states parties, meaning they're fully bound by the treaty. And then there's an additional 25 countries that have signed it, but have not yet ratified it. But that means that there's 99 countries that have taken some legal action, and that's, for those of us who are good at math, just 50.3% of that 197 number. And there's 40 more states that are supportive of the treaty but haven't yet taken those actions. So in the near term, those are the ones we expect to join it. And then we have the red states, which are mostly NATO states. And where do you think Canada is in this? They're in the red. I'll have a quick bit on that in a second. But this just breaks down where we are that I just described. And these two last states to take action a few weeks ago, Ghana, which ratified it, and Kyrgyzstan, which signed it, got us to our 99. I just explained all this. And so the total support for the treaty is more than 2/3 of the world, 73.3% of the world. And in addition, at these meetings of states parties, we've been taking forward the work of the treaty. It's not just about getting countries to join it, but also implementing it. So we have I'm just showing us the webpage that ICAN has that's sort of tracking the progress of the work to implement it. And this was going to be, just a breakdown of regionally of who supports the treaty. Yeah, as you see, most of there's support that's high in most regions apart from Europe, which is because that's where a lot of the NATO states are, almost all of them, and NATO has taken a position against the treaty for now. So that's just one thing I'd like you to think about, is what makes a position change for a country. I already previewed, and perhaps you would have guessed already where Canada is on this. Of course, Canada is one of those NATO states. It's funny because, Canada claims leadership in so many processes relating to disarmament. Obviously, the Ottawa Treaty is one of the most noteworthy ones. But with nuclear weapons, Canada often talks about being a non-nuclear weapon state, and yet I think has a long and complicated history with nuclear weapons, beginning with the Manhattan Project itself, because in case you haven't heard this yet, we had, in the process of creating the first nuclear weapons, Canada made a major contribution, mining and producing and sending to Los Alamos uranium that may have been used in the actual bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima. As I just mentioned as well, from 1950 until 1984, there were US nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. And today, Canada supports the retention and use of nuclear weapons in the context of, other NATO actions, and sort of just goes along with NATO policy on this. And we've had, a lot of well-worded diplomatic statements from Canadians, Foreign Minister Joly would say about how Canada supports the aims and the goals of the treaty, and then full stop, but well, why not do more? And we know that the key is the democratic support. On the day that the TPNW was adopted, the US led a press conference of other NATO states to say that the US would not ever, ever join this treaty. And I thought that was, well, perhaps they went further than I would have expected, but it also, I think, tipped the hand as to what I think a lot of these states really know, which is that they can't say that. If it's a true democracy, how can you speak for future generations even to say that you will not ever do it? And I think that's where our power is. We know from public opinion polls, for example, that 74% of Canadians believe that their government should join the TPNW. We know that the Parliament has a lot of active parliamentarians, some of whom we're lucky to have with us today, and that there's a motion that got unanimous support encouraging the government to engage with the TPNW. So we wonder when that's going to happen, but it's really up to us to ask for it. I have a couple of slides talking about how the treaty works on countries before they join it. Some people may say, well, what effect does it have on Canada before Canada joins it? What effect does it have on the United States or others? That's kind of a longer conversation, actually. I might not dive so deep into that, or I'll come back to it. But I think it is good to go through a bit just about how the treaty is useful in changing norms, the effect that it has on hosting sharing arrangements, like these countries that are basically going to use nuclear weapons for others. And so let me just, but I want to get to what you can do, a couple of things. So as some of you may know that Winnipeg has joined our ICAN Cities Appeal Initiative. This says that even if my national government doesn't support the treaty, the population of my city, and after all, it's cities most of all that are targeted by nuclear weapons, so cities should speak up, does support this treaty, does want our country to join it. And we have more than 600 cities in nuclear-armed and nuclear-endorsing states that have joined this. Paris, Berlin, Washington, D.C., New York, and in Canada, 20 cities, rather, that have joined it. Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, and, Winnipeg. Oh, I just erased that part. But, maybe you live in other cities, other municipalities, or other countries, for that matter. I know some of you are coming from, and you should also get your city to join it. We have a parliamentary pledge initiative. All of these things are described on the ICAN website, nuclearban.org. This is kind of a similar concept. In Canada, we've had, I think it's 39 House of Commons members and 28 senators, including Senator McFedrin, Senator McCallum, that have joined this. It's a similar idea where they say, you know, we call on our government to join the treaty. Why not ask your other local, provincial representatives to join, and support some of these initiatives that are already in the Parliament, including getting Canada to observe that first review conference that will happen next year. Whoops, got ahead of myself. Clicked too far ahead. But just to say that there's a lot of divestment initiatives. I think this is some of the most meaningful work that can happen before your country joins the treaty, is to get your city governments to take their money out of these, and it's only 26 companies, but the companies that manufacture and maintain nuclear weapons arsenals. This is something we've seen done, even in countries that don't like the TPNW. They've had national pension funds pull the money out because now it's illegal, and that exposes their investors to risk. So you can check out our Don't Bank on the Bomb report. You could talk to your parents, where's your money invested, where are our pensions? We don't think that should be in those companies that are invested in the destruction of humanity, and for that matter, all life. The universities part, I don't know how many of you will perhaps be going to school in the US. We didn't examine this for other countries, but we have a report called Schools of Mass Destruction that shows you what role these 50 universities in the US have in partnering with nuclear weapons labs, sometimes managing those labs, a lot of times providing jobs pipelines to those labs, and playing this really major role in the nuclear weapons industry that students and faculty and alumni should all be pushing to change. But the very first thing you can do is join us. I mean, we are a global campaign of other NGOs. Like, we're an NGO, a non-governmental organization, but we're comprised of other NGOs in 110 countries. We right now have more than 700 partner organizations. So we have, I think, like almost 30 in Canada. Many of them are here. So, you know, if you get interested by this summit, you can join them. You can make your own and partner with us that way. But I think, you know, the first thing to do is sort of, well, you're here, that was the first thing to do. And then, you know, check out our website, nuclearban.org, follow us, #nuclearban, and learn about us and the treaty. And there are so many ways this journey can go, but we want to be there to support all your ideas in bringing your country and the world to abolition. So with that, I think I'll stop and see if we have time for questions. I don't know. I lost track of time, so. Yeah, I'll open the floor to questions. Yeah, what do you think, sir?